Maria Santos never imagined that her morning jog through the hills outside Kabul would change her life forever. As a war correspondent for an international news agency, she had covered conflicts in over 15 countries, but Afghanistan held a special place in her heart. The people's resilience despite decades of war inspired her daily reporting. That Tuesday morning in March felt different. The air carried an unusual tension, and the normally bustling streets seemed quieter than usual. Local sources had been whispering about increased insurgent activity in the region, but Maria had learned to navigate such warnings carefully. Her Afghan translator and guide, Ahmad, had been particularly nervous the night before, repeatedly checking his phone and glancing toward the mountains. Maria had arrived in Afghanistan 6 months earlier to document the lives of women rebuilding their communities after years of conflict. Her series of articles had gained international attention, highlighting how ordinary women were creating extraordinary change in their neighborhoods. She had interviewed teachers secretly educating girls, mothers starting small businesses from their homes, and healthcare workers risking their lives to serve remote villages. The previous evening, she had received a tip about a women's literacy program operating in a village about 30 kilometers from the city. The program was run by Fatima, a former university professor who had lost her job but continued teaching women to read and write in secret. Maria knew this story could be powerful, showing how education persisted even in the most challenging circumstances. Ahmad had tried to dissuade her from making the trip. His contacts in the area reported unusual military movements, and several villages had gone silent on their radio communications. But Maria had built her career on getting the stories that others wouldn't pursue. She convinced Ahmad that they would travel early, conduct the interview quickly, and return before afternoon prayers when the roads typically became more dangerous. They set out at dawn in Ahmad's weathered Toyota Corolla, taking back roads that wound through small farming communities. The landscape was breathtaking, with snow-capped mountains providing a dramatic backdrop to terraced fields where farmers worked with their families. Maria always found these moments of beauty amid chaos to be the most profound part of her job. The first signs of trouble came when they passed through the third village. Usually children would wave at passing vehicles, and women could be seen tending to gardens or hanging laundry. Today, the streets were empty, and window shutters remained closed despite the pleasant weather. Ahmad pulled over to check with a shopkeeper he knew, but the man quickly disappeared inside his store when he saw them approaching. "Something is very wrong," Ahmad whispered as they continued driving. His knuckles were white as he gripped the steering wheel. "We should turn back." Maria understood his concern, but they were already halfway to their destination. Fatima was expecting them, and Maria knew how difficult it had been to arrange this meeting. The woman had taken significant risks agreeing to be interviewed, and Maria felt responsible for following through on her commitment. As they climbed higher into the hills, the road became narrower and more winding. Ancient stone walls lined the path, and occasional olive groves provided patches of green against the rocky terrain. Maria was reviewing her questions for Fatima when Ahmad suddenly slammed on the brakes. 3 men in military fatigues stood in the road ahead, their weapons raised. But these weren't government soldiers or international peacekeepers. Their equipment was mismatched, and black flags hung from their belts. Ahmad immediately recognized them as members of a local insurgent group that had been gaining strength in the region. "Drive backward quickly," Maria urged, but it was too late. More armed men emerged from behind the stone walls on both sides of the road. They were surrounded. The men approached the vehicle shouting commands in Pashto. Ahmad raised his hands and tried to explain that they were journalists, but the insurgents showed no interest in conversation. They demanded that both passengers exit the vehicle immediately. Maria's training kicked in. She kept her movements slow and deliberate, making no sudden gestures that could be interpreted as threatening. She carried her press credentials prominently displayed on a lanyard around her neck, hoping these might provide some protection. Ahmad translated frantically, explaining their purpose and destination. The leader of the group, a man with a thick beard and cold eyes, examined Maria's credentials with suspicion. He spoke rapidly to his companions, occasionally pointing at her camera equipment. It became clear they viewed her presence as much more than simple journalism. Through Ahmad's translation, Maria learned that the group believed she was working with government forces to identify their positions and movements. Her previous articles about women's empowerment had apparently been seen as propaganda against their strict interpretation of Islamic law. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. One of the younger insurgents became increasingly agitated, arguing with the leader in harsh tones. Ahmad's face grew pale as he listened to their exchange. He quietly informed Maria that some of the men wanted to take her hostage to exchange for imprisoned fighters, while others viewed her as an enemy who should be dealt with immediately. The leader ordered both of them to sit on the ground while the group debated their fate. Maria could feel her heart racing, but she forced herself to remain calm. She had been in dangerous situations before, but never felt this level of genuine threat to her life. The men continued their heated discussion, occasionally gesturing toward her and the vehicle. As the sun climbed higher, the temperature began to rise, and Maria realized they might be held here for hours. She thought about her family back home, wondering if they would ever learn what happened to her in these remote hills. Ahmad sat beside her, quietly praying under his breath. Then the leader made his decision. He spoke sharply to his men, who immediately moved to secure the area. Maria and Ahmad were forced to stand as the insurgents prepared to move them to a different location. The leader explained through Ahmad that they would be taken to a secure compound where higher-ranking commanders would decide their ultimate fate. As they were led away from the road toward a narrow mountain path, Maria caught a glimpse of the beautiful valley below. The peaceful farming communities continued their daily routines, unaware of the drama unfolding in the hills above them. She wondered if she would ever see such beauty again, and whether her story about Fatima's literacy program would ever be told. The mountain path proved treacherous as Maria and Ahmad were marched upward at gunpoint. Loose stones shifted under their feet, and the thin air at this altitude made breathing difficult. The insurgents showed no mercy for their pace, pushing them forward whenever they slowed. Maria's photographer's backpack felt heavier with each step, but she dared not ask to rest. After 2 hours of climbing, they reached a compound hidden among massive boulders and scraggly pine trees. The location was perfectly concealed from aerial view, explaining why military forces had never located this particular stronghold. Crude stone buildings had been constructed using the natural rock formations, creating an almost invisible fortress. The leader, who Ahmad learned was called Commander Rashid, directed them toward a small stone building with a heavy wooden door. Inside, the space was dim and cramped, with only a small window near the ceiling providing light. Thick carpets covered the floor, and cushions were arranged along the walls in traditional Afghan style. Maria was separated from Ahmad and placed in a different room. The isolation was immediate and frightening. She could hear voices speaking in urgent tones from other parts of the compound, but couldn't understand the conversations. Her mind raced through various scenarios, trying to calculate possible outcomes and escape routes. Hours passed with no food or water. The temperature in the stone room fluctuated dramatically as the sun moved across the sky. Maria tried to stay focused by mentally reviewing everything she knew about hostage survival techniques. She reminded herself that as long as they were keeping her alive, there was reason for hope. Near evening, Commander Rashid entered her room accompanied by an older man who spoke excellent English. This man, introduced as Mullah Hassan, served as both religious advisor and negotiator for the group. His presence suggested they were preparing for some form of communication with outside authorities. Mullah Hassan explained that Maria's situation was complicated. The group had initially planned to simply confiscate her equipment and send her back to Kabul with a warning. However, they had discovered among her notes the names and locations of several women she had interviewed for previous articles. This information could potentially identify women who were violating the group's strict interpretation of Islamic law. "Your work puts innocent women in danger," Mullah Hassan stated calmly. "These women must be protected from themselves and from outside influences that encourage them to abandon proper behavior." Maria tried to explain that her interviews were conducted with full consent and that she always protected her sources' identities in published articles. But Mullah Hassan was not interested in journalism ethics. The group viewed her presence as part of a larger Western conspiracy to undermine traditional values and religious authority. The real breakthrough came when Maria mentioned her upcoming interview with Fatima, the literacy teacher. Mullah Hassan's expression changed dramatically. He spoke rapidly with Commander Rashid in Pashto, their voices becoming increasingly agitated. Finally, he turned back to Maria with a grave expression. "This woman Fatima is already known to us," he revealed. "She has been teaching forbidden subjects to women in direct violation of religious law. We have been planning to address this situation, and your presence confirms our suspicions about her activities." Maria realized with horror that her journalistic mission had inadvertently provided intelligence that would endanger Fatima's life. The very story she hoped would celebrate the woman's courage might instead lead to her persecution or worse. The weight of this responsibility felt crushing. That night, Maria was given a small meal of rice and vegetables along with some water. The food was simple but prepared with care, suggesting that her captors were not entirely hostile. She could hear Ahmad's voice from somewhere nearby, apparently engaged in lengthy conversations with various members of the group. Unable to sleep, Maria spent the dark hours reflecting on the ethical complexities of war reporting. Every story carried risks, but she had always believed that bringing attention to important issues justified those risks. Now she faced the possibility that her work might directly harm the very people she sought to help. The next morning brought unexpected developments. Maria was awakened by the sound of vehicles approaching the compound. Through her small window, she could see several trucks arriving with more armed men. The activity level in the compound increased dramatically, with people moving urgently between buildings. Mullah Hassan returned to explain the situation. Word of Maria's capture had somehow reached government forces, and military units were now conducting searches throughout the region. The insurgent group was preparing to relocate to an even more remote location, and Maria's presence was becoming a liability. "We cannot risk keeping you here while government soldiers search for you," he explained. "But we also cannot simply release you with the information you possess about our activities and locations." The group was facing a dilemma. Killing a foreign journalist would bring unwanted international attention and military pressure. But releasing her might compromise their security and endanger their members. They needed a solution that would protect their interests while avoiding escalation. During these discussions, Maria learned more about the group's motivations and grievances. Many were young men from villages that had suffered under various military occupations over the decades. They viewed foreign presence, including journalists, as part of a continuing pattern of outside interference in Afghan affairs. Commander Rashid had lost his entire family in an airstrike several years earlier. His hatred for foreigners was personal and deep, making him particularly dangerous in Maria's situation. Other members of the group seemed more pragmatic, recognizing that harming a journalist might bring consequences that would ultimately harm their cause. As the day progressed, the sounds of helicopters could be heard in the distance. Government forces were clearly intensifying their search efforts. Maria realized that her best hope for survival lay in convincing her captors that releasing her would serve their interests better than continuing to hold her. The breakthrough came when she offered to write a story about their perspective and grievances. Through Mullah Hassan, she proposed documenting their side of the conflict, explaining their motivations and the conditions that had driven them to insurgency. This would be unprecedented access that no other journalist had been offered. The proposal created intense debate within the group. Some members saw it as an opportunity to present their message to the world. Others viewed it as a Western trick designed to gather intelligence about their operations. The discussions continued well into the evening, with Maria's fate hanging in the balance. Finally, Commander Rashid made a decision that surprised everyone. Rather than accepting or rejecting Maria's proposal, he announced that they would seek guidance from higher-ranking commanders in the organization. This meant moving Maria to yet another location where senior leaders could evaluate the situation personally. The preparation for this move began immediately. With the compound being systematically cleared of all evidence of occupation, Maria was given her backpack and camera equipment, suggesting that the group was at least considering her proposal seriously. Ahmad was also prepared for transport, though they would continue to be held separately. As they prepared to leave the compound under cover of darkness, Maria couldn't shake the feeling that events were building toward a climax she couldn't predict. The sound of helicopters had grown more frequent throughout the day, and she wondered if government forces were closer to finding them than her captors realized. The convoy of 3 vehicles moved through the darkness using routes that avoided main roads entirely. Maria found herself blindfolded and squeezed between 2 armed guards in the back seat of a pickup truck. The journey was rough and disorienting, with frequent stops where the drivers would turn off engines and listen for aircraft overhead. After what felt like hours of travel, they arrived at a much larger compound built into the side of a mountain. This facility was clearly more permanent and sophisticated than the previous location. Solar panels provided electricity, and Maria could see communication equipment and satellite dishes positioned strategically around the perimeter. Commander Rashid led her into a well-furnished room where 3 older men waited. These were regional commanders of the insurgent organization, men whose decisions affected operations across multiple provinces. Their presence indicated that Maria's case had attracted high-level attention within the group's hierarchy. The eldest commander, introduced as General Mahmoud, spoke with quiet authority. His English was limited, but his intelligence was obvious in how carefully he listened to translations and asked precise questions. Through Mullah Hassan, he explained that Maria's proposal to tell their story had created an unprecedented opportunity. For years, the world has heard only one side of this conflict, General Mahmoud stated through the translator. Western media portrays us as terrorists and extremists, never explaining the injustices that drove us to fight. Perhaps it is time for the truth to be heard. However, this opportunity came with strict conditions. Maria would be required to spend several days interviewing various commanders and fighters, documenting their personal stories and motivations. The resulting articles would need to be reviewed and approved by the organization before publication. Most importantly, she would be required to include specific political demands in her reporting. Maria understood that accepting these conditions would compromise her journalistic integrity, but refusing might cost her life. She requested time to consider the proposal, hoping to find a way to satisfy her captors while maintaining some degree of professional ethics. That night, she was housed in a comfortable room with proper bedding and regular meals. The treatment was respectful, almost like a guest rather than a prisoner. Maria began to understand that the organization was testing whether she could be useful for their propaganda purposes while also evaluating the risks of releasing her. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. Ahmad was finally allowed to see her, though their conversation was closely monitored. He appeared physically unharmed but emotionally shaken by his experience. Through careful word choices, he managed to convey that government forces were actively searching for them and that international pressure was building for her release. Ahmad also revealed that he had been questioned extensively about Maria's previous articles and the women she had interviewed. The insurgents were particularly interested in the literacy program run by Fatima, which they now viewed as a direct challenge to their authority in the region. They are planning to raid the school, Ahmad whispered during a brief moment when their guard was distracted. Fatima and her students are in great danger. This revelation forced Maria to confront the full consequences of her capture. Not only was her own life at risk, but her journalistic work was being used to target innocent women whose only crime was seeking education. The weight of responsibility felt overwhelming. General Mahmoud returned that afternoon with a modified proposal. Instead of spending days conducting interviews, Maria would be allowed to interview just 3 fighters about their personal stories. In exchange, she would be required to include a statement from the organization outlining their demands for peace negotiations with the government. The 3 fighters selected for interviews represented different aspects of the insurgency. The first was a young man whose village had been destroyed in military operations. The second was a former government soldier who had defected after witnessing corruption and brutality. The third was a religious scholar who provided theological justification for their resistance. Maria conducted these interviews with professional detachment, asking probing questions while recognizing the propaganda value her captors hoped to extract. Each man's story contained elements of genuine grievance mixed with ideological rhetoric. She began to understand how personal trauma and religious conviction combined to create committed insurgents. During the interview with the religious scholar, Maria learned more about the group's specific objections to women's education programs. According to their interpretation, such programs violated religious law and corrupted traditional family structures. This ideology made Fatima's literacy school a particular target for their enforcement activities. The scholar explained that the organization viewed foreign journalists as tools of cultural invasion, spreading Western values that undermined Islamic society. Maria's articles about women's empowerment were seen as evidence of this broader conspiracy, making her both a valuable propaganda asset and a dangerous enemy. As the interviews concluded, Maria realized that her captors were preparing for her release. The process had served multiple purposes for them, gathering intelligence about her previous work, testing her willingness to cooperate with their messaging, and demonstrating their sophisticated media awareness to other members of the organization. However, the timing of her release was complicated by ongoing military operations in the area. Government forces had intensified their search efforts, making movement dangerous for the insurgent group. They needed to find a way to release Maria without exposing their location or members to capture. The solution came from an unexpected source. Intelligence reports indicated that a major military operation was planned for the following day, targeting several suspected insurgent locations in the region. The group decided to release Maria in a way that would actually assist their own escape from the advancing forces. General Mahmoud explained the plan through Mullah Hassan. Maria and Ahmad would be taken to a location near one of the military targets and released just before the operation began. Their presence would provide a cover story for any insurgent movement in the area, as government forces would be focused on rescuing the journalists rather than pursuing fleeing fighters. This plan served the insurgents' interests while also ensuring Maria's safety, since she would be quickly found by advancing government troops. However, it also meant that her release would coincide with a military operation that might target the very compound where she had been held. The final evening at the mountain compound was tense with preparation. Maria was returned her personal belongings and camera equipment. Though her memory cards had been reviewed and some images deleted, she was also given copies of the recorded interviews with the three fighters, along with the written statement of political demands that she was expected to include in her reporting. Mullah Hassan provided a final briefing about the organization's expectations for her articles. While they could not control what she ultimately published, they made clear that her future safety in Afghanistan would depend on how fairly she portrayed their perspective. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. As night fell, Maria prepared for what she hoped would be her final journey as a captive. The plan called for movement before dawn, positioning her and Ahmad near the military target area, just as government forces began their operation. The timing would need to be precise to ensure their safety, while allowing the insurgents to escape. Commander Rashid appeared for a final conversation, speaking through translation with unexpected emotion. Despite his hatred for foreign presence in Afghanistan, he had developed a grudging respect for Maria's courage and professionalism during her captivity. He warned her that other insurgent groups might not be as restrained if she continued reporting in dangerous areas. The vehicles were loaded under cover of darkness, with Maria and Ahmad placed in a specially modified truck that would allow for quick release when they reached the designated location. As they prepared to leave the mountain compound, the sound of distant helicopters reminded everyone that government forces were closing in on the area. The pre-dawn journey through winding mountain roads was Maria's most harrowing experience yet. The convoy moved without headlights, navigating by moonlight and intimate knowledge of the terrain. Several times they stopped completely while drivers listened for aircraft engines, and twice they pulled off the road entirely to hide under tree cover as helicopters passed overhead. Maria could sense the growing tension among her captors. Radio communications crackled with urgent reports in Pashto, and she noticed that some of the younger fighters appeared nervous and agitated. The military pressure was clearly affecting the entire organization, not just those directly involved in her case. After 3 hours of careful movement, they reached a valley position about 2 kilometers from what Ahmad whispered was a known insurgent supply depot. The location was perfect for the group's plan, positioning Maria and Ahmad where advancing government forces would quickly discover them while providing multiple escape routes for the insurgents. Commander Rashid personally oversaw the final preparations for their release. Maria and Ahmad were given water and food packages, along with a small radio tuned to government military frequencies. This would allow them to contact approaching forces and identify themselves as civilians rather than combatants. The commander's final instructions were delivered with surprising formality. Maria was reminded of her commitment to include the organization's political statement in her reporting, and warned that other insurgent groups were monitoring how she handled this story. Her future ability to work safely in Afghanistan would depend on demonstrating respect for the perspectives she had been shown. As the insurgents prepared to withdraw to their escape positions, the sound of approaching helicopters grew louder and more distinct. The timing was working exactly as planned, with government forces beginning their operation just as Maria was being positioned for rescue. The moment of release came suddenly. Commander Rashid simply nodded to his men, who quickly removed Maria's and Ahmad's restraints and pointed toward a cluster of rocks about 50 meters away. "Government soldiers will find you there within 1 hour," Mullah Hassan translated. "Remember what you have learned here." Maria and Ahmad moved quickly toward the indicated position while the insurgents melted away into the mountain terrain with practiced efficiency. Within minutes, the area appeared completely empty, except for the 2 journalists huddled among the rocks with their radio and supplies. The wait was agonizing. Maria could hear helicopter engines growing closer, but she also worried about being caught in crossfire if government forces engaged fleeing insurgents. Ahmad monitored the military radio frequency, preparing to announce their presence when contact seemed imminent. The first helicopter appeared over the ridge just as the sun began to rise. Maria activated the emergency beacon she had been given, while Ahmad broadcast their position and civilian status on the military frequency. The response was immediate and professional, with the helicopter pilot confirming their location and requesting that they remain stationary. Within minutes, 2 additional helicopters arrived and began circling the area while ground forces approached on foot. Maria could see soldiers moving carefully through the terrain, clearly expecting possible ambush from insurgent fighters. The professionalism and caution of the military operation impressed her after days of uncertainty about government capabilities. The lead soldier who reached their position was a captain named Stevens, an American advisor working with Afghan government forces. His relief at finding Maria alive was obvious, and he immediately radioed for medical evacuation, while his team secured the area. "We've been searching for you for 3 days," Captain Stevens explained as medics checked Maria and Ahmad for injuries. "Intelligence reports suggested you were being held somewhere in this region, but we couldn't pinpoint the exact location until this morning." Maria learned that her disappearance had triggered a massive search operation involving multiple military units and intelligence agencies. International pressure from her news organization and government contacts had elevated the case to high priority status, explaining the resources being devoted to her rescue. The medical examination revealed that both Maria and Ahmad were in good physical condition despite their ordeal. The insurgents had actually treated them quite well, providing adequate food, water, and shelter throughout their captivity. This surprised the military personnel, who were accustomed to dealing with much harsher treatment of hostages. During the helicopter evacuation to a secure military base, Maria reflected on the complexity of her experience. While clearly held against her will, she had not been mistreated or tortured. The insurgents had specific political and ideological goals that they pursued through sophisticated negotiation, rather than simple violence. The debriefing process at the military base was thorough and professional. Intelligence officers were particularly interested in the locations where Maria had been held and the organizational structure she had observed. However, she carefully limited her responses to information that would not endanger individuals who had treated her humanely. Colonel Martinez, the base commander, explained that the military operation was still ongoing. Several insurgent positions had been targeted simultaneously with Maria's rescue, resulting in the capture of significant weapons caches and communication equipment. However, most of the insurgent personnel had successfully escaped the encirclement. Maria was surprised to learn that intelligence about the planned operation had come partly from intercepted communications related to her own case. The insurgents' preparations for her release had inadvertently revealed information about their locations and movement patterns, allowing military forces to plan the broader offensive. The irony was not lost on her that becoming a hostage had ultimately provided intelligence that harmed her captor's operations. This raised additional ethical questions about the intersection between journalism and military intelligence that she would need to consider carefully in her reporting. International media attention focused intensely on Maria's rescue, with news organizations around the world requesting interviews and statements. However, she was not yet ready to discuss her experience publicly. The stories she had heard from the insurgent fighters were still processing in her mind, along with the political demands she had been asked to convey. The most pressing concern was the fate of Fatima and her literacy students. Intelligence officers confirmed that the insurgents had indeed raided the school during Maria's captivity, arresting several women and confiscating educational materials. Fatima herself had escaped, but her whereabouts remained unknown. This news devastated Maria, confirming her worst fears about the consequences of her journalistic work. The very people she had hoped to help and celebrate had become targets because of information gathered during her interviews. The ethical implications would haunt her reporting for years to come. Ahmad was released after his own debriefing session, but he appeared deeply shaken by the entire experience. He had learned details about insurgent operations that put him at personal risk if he remained in Afghanistan. Maria realized that her translator's life had been fundamentally changed by their shared ordeal. As evening approached at the military base, Maria was informed that arrangements were being made for her evacuation to a safer location outside Afghanistan. Her news organization and government officials had concluded that her continued presence in the country posed unacceptable risks to both her safety and ongoing military operations. The decision to leave Afghanistan felt like both relief and failure. Maria had come to document stories of courage and resilience, particularly among women facing extraordinary challenges. Instead, her work had inadvertently contributed to the persecution of the very people she had sought to help. Colonel Martinez provided a final briefing about the ongoing security situation. Intelligence suggested that other insurgent groups were aware of Maria's capture and release, and some viewed her survival as evidence of collaboration with government forces. Her ability to work safely in Afghanistan was severely compromised. As Maria prepared for departure the next morning, she struggled with how to fulfill her journalistic obligations while protecting the people who had become entangled in her story. The insurgents' demand that she include their political statement in her reporting created an ethical dilemma with no clear resolution. The helicopter that would take her to Kabul for international evacuation was scheduled to arrive at dawn. Maria spent her final night at the remote military base reviewing her notes and recordings, trying to find a way to tell this story that would serve truth, while minimizing harm to innocent people caught in the middle of an ongoing conflict. The dawn helicopter flight to Kabul provided Maria with her first clear view of the terrain, where she had been held captive. From the air, the mountain compounds were completely invisible, hidden by natural rock formations and careful camouflage. She marveled at how the insurgents had created such sophisticated facilities in seemingly inaccessible locations. During the flight, the pilot pointed out several other sites that had been targeted in the coordinated military operation. Smoke columns rose from distant valleys where weapons caches had been destroyed, and she could see military vehicles moving along mountain roads. The scale of the operation triggered by her kidnapping was far larger than she had imagined. At Kabul's international airport, Maria was met by representatives from her news organization, the embassy, and Afghan government officials. The media attention was intense, with journalists from around the world seeking interviews about her experience. However, she was quickly moved to a secure location away from the crowds and cameras. Her editor, James Morrison, had flown in from London specifically to handle her evacuation and debrief her about the story. His relief at seeing her alive was obvious, but he was also clearly concerned about the ethical and legal implications of her captivity experience. The insurgents' demand that she include their political statement created unprecedented challenges for the news organization. We've never faced a situation where a journalist was essentially coerced into becoming a propaganda vehicle, Morrison explained during their private meeting. Legal experts are reviewing whether publishing content created under duress would violate journalistic standards or even constitute material support for terrorist organizations. Maria shared the recorded interviews with the 3 insurgent fighters, along with the written political demands. The personal stories were compelling and newsworthy, but they had clearly been selected and shaped to serve the organization's propaganda purposes. Publishing them without proper context would essentially make her a mouthpiece for the insurgency. The most troubling aspect was learning about the full consequences of her journalistic work. Intelligence reports confirmed that the literacy school had been completely destroyed, with several women arrested and others forced to flee their homes. Fatima remained missing, possibly dead, and her students had scattered to avoid further persecution. "Your interviews with these women made them targets," Morrison stated bluntly. "The insurgents used your notes to identify people they considered violators of their interpretation of Islamic law. We need to consider whether continuing this type of reporting is ethically justifiable." The conversation was interrupted by news that fundamentally changed everything. Intelligence officers reported that 3 high-ranking military generals were requesting an immediate meeting with Maria before her departure from Afghanistan. This was highly unusual, suggesting that her experience had implications beyond simple hostage rescue. General Patricia Williams, the senior NATO commander in Afghanistan, arrived at the embassy compound with 2 Afghan generals. Their presence indicated that Maria's case had attracted attention at the highest levels of military and political leadership. The meeting was classified at the highest security level, General. Williams explained that intercepted communications during Maria's captivity had revealed significant intelligence about insurgent operations and organizational structure. The recordings and documents obtained during her rescue were providing unprecedented insights into how the insurgency operated and planned its activities. "Your experience, while traumatic, has given us the most detailed view of insurgent leadership we've ever obtained," General Williams revealed. "The interviews you conducted, even under duress, contain information that could significantly impact our counterinsurgency operations. However, this intelligence value created additional ethical complications for Maria's reporting. Publishing details about insurgent operations might compromise ongoing military efforts and endanger intelligence sources." The line between journalism and military intelligence was becoming increasingly blurred. The Afghan generals were particularly interested in the organizational structure Maria had observed. The sophisticated communication equipment and coordination between different insurgent groups suggested a level of capability that intelligence agencies had underestimated. Her first-hand observations were helping to revise strategic assessments of the insurgency's strength. Maria learned that her kidnapping had not been opportunistic, but rather a carefully planned operation. The insurgents had been monitoring her movements for weeks, waiting for an opportunity to capture her without triggering immediate military response. Her planned interview with Fatima had provided the perfect opportunity. The intelligence briefing also revealed the broader context of the insurgent demands that she had been asked to convey. The organization was facing increasing pressure from government forces and needed to demonstrate political sophistication to maintain support from sympathetic populations. Using a Western journalist to carry their message was part of this strategy. General Williams made a request that stunned Maria and her editor. Military intelligence wanted to use Maria as an ongoing source of information about insurgent operations, potentially including future contact with the organization. The generals believed that her unique access could provide intelligence unavailable through traditional methods. "We're not asking you to become a spy," General Williams clarified, "but your professional relationship with these individuals could be valuable for understanding their motivations and plans. Information you gather as a journalist could help prevent attacks that might kill innocent civilians." Morrison immediately objected to this proposal, arguing that it would completely compromise Maria's journalistic integrity and put her at enormous personal risk. Using journalists as intelligence assets was prohibited by his organization's ethics codes and would destroy Maria's credibility as an independent reporter. The meeting revealed that Maria's case was being viewed as a potential model for future negotiations with insurgent groups. Her relatively humane treatment and sophisticated political discussions suggested that some insurgent leaders might be open to dialogue rather than pure military confrontation. However, the military's interest in her experience also meant that her movements and communications would be monitored for the foreseeable future. Intelligence agencies needed to ensure that insurgent groups could not use her to transmit information or coordinate activities. Her freedom would be significantly restricted. As the briefing concluded, Maria realized that her journalistic career in conflict zones might effectively be over. The combination of personal trauma, ethical complications, and ongoing security concerns made it Impossible to continue the type of reporting that had defined her professional life. The final decision about her stories' publication was postponed pending legal review and security clearance. Elements of her experience might never be published if they contained information that could endanger ongoing operations or compromise intelligence methods. That evening, Maria received unexpected news through embassy channels. Fatima, the literacy teacher whose school had been destroyed, was alive and in hiding with sympathetic families in a different province. She had managed to escape during the raid and was slowly rebuilding her educational network in a new location. This news provided some relief from the guilt Maria felt about the consequences of her reporting. While her work had indeed put Fatima in danger, the woman's courage and resilience had allowed her to survive and continue her mission. The story of women's determination to pursue education despite enormous risks remained relevant and important. The complexity of Maria's situation deepened when she learned that Commander Rashid had been killed during the military operation that followed her rescue. Despite his role as her captor, she had developed a grudging respect for his intelligence and restraint. His death added another layer of moral complexity to her experience. Intelligence reports indicated that Rashid had been directing the evacuation of his fighters when government forces overran his position. Rather than surrendering, he had chosen to fight to the end, allowing most of his men to escape. His final radio transmission reportedly included instructions to treat any future foreign captives with the same professionalism he had shown Maria. The news of Rashid's death troubled Maria more than she expected. While he had threatened her life and used her for propaganda purposes, he had also protected her from more extremist elements within his organization. His death meant that future journalists might not receive the same relatively humane treatment. Mullah Hassan had also been captured during the operations, though he remained alive in government custody. Intelligence officers were debriefing him about the insurgent organization's structure and plans. His sophisticated understanding of Western media and politics was providing valuable insights into how insurgent groups planned to influence international opinion. The three generals informed Maria that Hassan had specifically asked to send her a message. Through official channels, he conveyed his hope that she would honor the commitment to tell their story fairly, despite the changed circumstances. Even in captivity, the insurgents were thinking strategically about media relations and propaganda. As Maria prepared for her departure from Afghanistan, she received one final piece of information that would shape her future reporting. Intelligence analysts had discovered that her kidnapping was part of a broader insurgent strategy to capture and influence Western journalists throughout the region. Similar operations were being planned against other reporters working in Afghanistan and neighboring countries. This revelation meant that Maria's experience was not unique, but rather part of a systematic campaign to weaponize international media coverage of the conflict. Other journalists were at risk of similar capture and coercion, making her story even more important as a warning to the international press corps. The ethical implications of this broader campaign were staggering. If insurgent groups could successfully coerce journalists into carrying their propaganda messages, the integrity of all conflict reporting would be compromised. News organizations would need to develop new protocols for protecting their staff and maintaining editorial independence. General Williams concluded the briefing with a sobering assessment. Maria's case represented a new evolution in asymmetric warfare, where capturing hearts and minds through media manipulation was becoming as important as traditional military tactics. Understanding and countering this strategy would be crucial for future counterinsurgency efforts. As Maria boarded the aircraft that would take her away from Afghanistan, she carried with her recordings, documents, and memories that would reshape how the international community understood modern insurgency. Her experience had inadvertently provided a window into sophisticated enemy tactics that few outsiders had ever witnessed firsthand. The flight to safety marked the end of her captivity, but the beginning of a much more complex challenge. How could she fulfill her responsibility as a journalist to tell important stories while avoiding the manipulation and exploitation that had characterized her recent experience? The answer would define the rest of her career and influence how other journalists approached similar situations in the future. 6 months after her rescue, Maria sat in her London apartment reviewing the final draft of her article about the kidnapping experience. The piece had gone through multiple revisions as lawyers, editors, and security experts examined every detail for potential legal and safety implications. What had started as a straightforward news story had become one of the most complex editorial challenges in modern journalism. The published version would include selected portions of her interviews with the insurgent fighters, but with careful analysis and context that avoided simply amplifying their propaganda messages. Maria had worked with terrorism experts and regional scholars to provide readers with the background needed to understand the insurgents' grievances without legitimizing their methods. The political demands that the insurgents had insisted she convey were included in the article, but as part of a broader examination of insurgent media strategy, rather than as standalone statements. This approach satisfied her commitment to report what she had experienced while maintaining journalistic integrity and avoiding direct collaboration with the organization's propaganda goals. Ahmad had been relocated to Britain through a special visa program for translators and journalists who had assisted international media. The trauma of their shared experience had created a lasting bond between them, and he was now working with Maria to establish a foundation supporting Afghan women's education initiatives. Their goal was to find ways to continue the work that Fatima and others had started, but with better security measures. The Foundation's first project was providing scholarships for Afghan women to study abroad, allowing them to gain education that could later be used to help their communities. They had also developed a secure communication network that allowed underground schools like Fatima's to share resources and coordinate activities while avoiding detection by hostile groups. Maria had received word through carefully monitored channels that Fatima was indeed alive and had successfully re-established her literacy program in a new location. The teacher had sent a message expressing gratitude for Maria's efforts to tell women's stories, despite the dangers this had created. Fatima's resilience and continued commitment to education provided hope that the work would continue despite ongoing obstacles. The broader impact of Maria's experience was already being felt throughout the international journalism community. News organizations had implemented new security protocols for reporting in conflict zones, and several major outlets had decided to suspend certain types of investigative reporting in areas where insurgent groups were known to target journalists. These changes represented a victory for the insurgents' strategy of using kidnapping and coercion to influence media coverage. By making certain stories too dangerous to pursue, they were effectively censoring international reporting about their activities and the conditions in territories under their influence. Maria had been invited to speak at journalism schools and professional conferences about the ethical challenges she had faced. Her presentation focused on the balance between pursuing important stories and avoiding manipulation by hostile actors. The questions from young journalists were increasingly sophisticated as the profession grappled with new forms of information warfare. The most difficult part of her recovery had been dealing with survivor guilt about the consequences of her work. While she had not intended to endanger the women she interviewed, the fact remained that her reporting had made them targets for persecution. This knowledge would influence every future story she considered pursuing. Therapy sessions with specialists in conflict trauma had helped Maria process her experience and develop strategies for continuing her career. The therapist emphasized that her work, highlighting women's courage under difficult circumstances, remained valuable despite the risks involved. The key was finding ways to tell these stories that minimized harm to vulnerable sources. Intelligence agencies had continued to monitor communications from the insurgent group that had held Maria captive. The organization had apparently used her case as a training example for other cells, demonstrating how to extract propaganda value from captured journalists while maintaining plausible deniability about coercion. This tactical evolution represented a significant challenge for counterinsurgency efforts. Traditional military operations could degrade insurgent capabilities, but their growing sophistication in information warfare required entirely different defensive strategies. Maria's experience had helped military planners understand this emerging threat. The legal review of Maria's article had revealed gaps in international law regarding journalist protection in conflict zones. Current treaties focused primarily on preventing violence against media workers, but did not address more subtle forms of coercion and manipulation. Legal scholars were beginning to develop new frameworks for protecting press freedom in these complex situations. Maria had been contacted by other journalists who had faced similar situations in different conflict zones around the world. Their shared experiences suggested that insurgent groups were learning from each other and adapting successful tactics across different theaters of operation. The challenge was becoming global rather than regional. The financial impact of her kidnapping had been substantial for Maria's news organization. The rescue operation, legal review, and ongoing security measures had cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. These expenses were causing some media companies to reconsider whether certain types of conflict reporting remained economically viable. Despite these challenges, Maria had decided to continue working as a foreign correspondent, though with modified approaches and enhanced security measures. Her experience had actually made her more valuable to news organizations seeking reporters who understood the complex realities of modern conflict. Journalism, the story of her kidnapping, would be published exactly 1 year after her rescue, timed to coincide with a major international conference on press freedom. Maria hoped that sharing her experience would help other journalists avoid similar situations while also highlighting the continued importance of reporting from dangerous areas. The final paragraph of her article addressed the question that readers would inevitably ask: whether the risks of conflict journalism remained justified given the potential consequences. Maria's answer was nuanced, acknowledging that each story required careful evaluation of potential benefits against possible harm to sources and communities. She concluded with a reflection on Fatima's continued work educating women despite enormous personal risk. The teacher's courage in pursuing her mission despite threats and persecution exemplified the human resilience that made conflict reporting valuable. Stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things under difficult circumstances remained essential for helping the world understand the true cost and meaning of global conflicts. As Maria prepared to submit her final draft, she realized that her experience had fundamentally changed her understanding of journalism's role in modern warfare. The days when reporters could simply observe and report events were ending. In an era of information warfare, journalists themselves had become weapons that hostile actors sought to capture and employ for their own purposes. This evolution required new approaches to training, security, and editorial decision-making that the profession was only beginning to develop. Maria's story would contribute to this learning process, helping to protect future generations of journalists, while preserving their ability to tell important stories that the world needed to hear. The publication of her article would mark not just the end of her personal ordeal, but the beginning of a broader conversation about journalism's future in an increasingly complex and dangerous world. Her experience in the mountains of Afghanistan had revealed challenges that would define conflict reporting for decades to come.